So let's see what we can address here today. Productivity in pharma, as we heard before and all of yesterday, is notoriously poor compared to other sectors. There are two potential key drivers that could change that, and one of them is technology and one of them is creativity. And yet there appear to be so many barriers to prevent us succeeding and reaping the benefits that could harness such things if we all work together well. Now, innovation is often perceived to be driven by the SME biotech sector, although, of course, there are pockets of proper innovation in Big Pharma, CROs, CMOs. Big Pharma says it seeks innovative and creative ways to bring new drugs to market, yet its actions seem to be designed to ensure it doesn't happen, believe me. Conversely, every SME is in business because they truly believe they are the way, the truth, and the light. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't be in business, and they certainly won't be in business tomorrow. So there are compromises. Today, we'd like to discuss what are the attributes that underpin successful innovation, what are the barriers that are there adopting innovative new practices, and is it, or it is, inevitable that successful small companies become large? What are the things, the practices, the strategies, the tools, the values that can be incorporated into partnerships and organisation to help bridge these challenges? Now, our panel today brings experience and expertise from across the sector and from beyond. And we will start the discussion here, but very much we're looking for this to be interactive because there is much innovation, thoughts and points of view on the floor that are represented here. So please, we do ask you to try and participate. If you do, raise your hand and I'll try and spot you. And if the light's shining in my eyes, wave a bit more vigorously and I'll catch you. So let's start with some introductions. So, Nigel, bit of background about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. So I'm Nigel Blackburn. I'm Director of Drug Development at Cancer Research UK. So my background, majority has been time's been spent in Big Pharma. I was in clinical development for most of my career at Roche, for nearly 19 years, and then I joined a very, very small Cambridge biotech that was flying by the seat of its pants, bumping along from one year to the next, trying to get funding. And then they ran out of money, and I came to Cancer Research UK. And there I run what I think is a very unique organisation, Centre for Drug Development. We sit within the charity, and we do drug development, just like a small biotech. We're funded by the charity, portfolio is entirely oncology. But we're not there to compete. We're not trying to compete with pharma or biotech. We aim to complement. And we aim to do that by taking on the riskier projects, the stuff that other people aren't prepared to license because it's either too niche, too early, too unproven or whatever. And so sit in a really interesting space where we work with pharma, we work with biotech, and we work with academia. So I've kind of seen the problem from many different sides here, and that's why I was really interested in participating today.
Thank you, Nigel. Sylvia.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sylvia Lobo. I work in regulatory strategy for Pfizer. I've been dabbling in regulatory strategy for 19 years across 3 big pharma companies and in multiple therapeutic areas. So very interested in the previous discussion we had about regulatory and whether that's constraining or liberating. I'll offer up 3 very brief thoughts here in terms of liberation. Where are we with compliance? Where are we with creativity? And I have a phrase that I use with my teams: avoid being a template thinker.
Thank you. And Matthew, or Matt.
Yeah, Matt Hansen. I am the head of the contract services business at Merck. I've been with the company for quite some time. I'm a chemist by background, although it took me my academic career to figure out what I wasn't good at. I have basically been involved in the API development and manufacturing business for the past 15 years. Also worked at Monsanto and other companies prior. I've kind of got an interesting background, having worked for small startups and now large multinationals. And this subject matter in particular is really interesting to me because what I get back to is how do you drive value here? The discussion around value is really important, and to me, the more and more we can dialogue about that subject matter and get to what is the purest elements of generating value in this area is really important.
Thank you. Last year at the discussion that we had about thinking outside the box, we had Jonathan Abrams joined us, and he came from a background in Google and was very new to our type of field and brought, I thought, some really interesting challenges. So this year I've asked Johnny if he can join us and tell us a bit about his background and now the transition that he's making to facilitate real change in our industry. Thank you, Johnny.
Thanks, Maureen, and no small billing there. I'm not from the pharma industry. Originally, I was in advertising. I was at a company called Saatchi & Saatchi in the 80s when it was widely regarded as the best advertising agency in the world. I left in the early 90s when it was by far and away the biggest, but certainly not the best. I became managing director of a small agency and grew it into a medium-sized agency when we were acquired by a very big agency. And I used that as an opportunity to get out of the industry. I joined a friend of mine, a guy called Nick Jones, in developing a club and hotel business called Soho House, which I left in 2006 as a director there, till 2006 when we were acquired by Richard Caring, and in 2007 I set up a biotechnology company called Touchlight, which is probably a weird path for people to take. In the early part of the millennia, like many lay people, I got very interested in the human genome and the Human Genome Project. I was obsessed by one thought, which was, if you look at the 20th century, it was defined by the computer, and we got to the computer by understanding algorithms. So once we sequenced the human genome, which was nature's code, it stood to reason in my mind that there were going to be new applications of that code, and there were going to be many new applications of that code. Now that may be a very naive thought, but it obsessed me. And when I started getting closer to that thought, I looked at the way in which DNA was made, which to me seemed straight out of the Middle Ages. It was bacterial brewing. You'd take a gene, you'd insert it into a plasmid, you'd amplify it in E. coli and giant fermenters, and you would let it do its work, and then you would have a complicated lysis and purification process, and you'd end up with a product that was prone to batch failure and expensive and slow, and it didn't seem part of this next generation of thinking. So I set up Touchlight in 2007, and we developed the enzymatic means of amplifying DNA, 2 enzymes. We set up 3 teams. The first was to establish a patent portfolio and to develop process, and then they grew into a team that just knocked our IP the whole time and developed new processes, and cut forward 8 years, and we've developed quite a big, broad patent estate, including processes, products, automation and various things. The second group was a manufacturing group that we were bringing center stage, and their job was to scale the technology into evidence it, and always use benchmark it against plasmid, and cut forward 8 years. And we've developed processes that are bigger, better, cheaper, faster. Bigger, we can amplify any gene. Well, we routinely do 15 kb genes, which plasmid would knock out. We could do it at scale. We can do grams and potentially kilograms of DNA. We are better insofar as the product doesn't have any antibiotic resistance genes, because they're not there at the beginning. No origins of replication, it's just the gene alone. We can amplify anything. We've never been able to not amplify a gene. And cheaper, it's difficult to direct comparison, but it's probably an order of magnitude cheaper, and faster, a process that may take months, if not, several months. In doing plasmid, we can do it in a couple of weeks in a disposal reaction. So, sorry, that sounds like a shameless plug. It's not. It's just trying to do a context of why I'm here. What we want to, the reason I was particularly interested in what is going on is it struck me that the whole pretext of the conversation today and yesterday is about change. And from my perspective, I wanted to get a handle myself as to whether that's real change and really people wanted to adopt change, because some of the things that we are looking at and where we've evidenced our technology in CAR-T, AAV, lentivirus for gene therapy, for making a starting material from mRNA, for in vivo expression monoclonal antibodies, for therapeutic vaccines. We've actually even taken it into the DNA as a smart polymer in areas like DNA nanowires or hydrogels or OLEDs. These are things of the future. And it may be just us, but we do think that there is change afoot. And we think there are very smart companies that are really looking to the healthcare sector as a way of developing new change. We started a business development program about a year ago. We won an award, and so that put us in a little bit of limelight. And so we started engaging with Big Pharma. And now we're in discussions with 8 out of the 10 Big Pharma groups, and we've had different reactions to change. I think they all feel that change is afoot, but maybe they don't necessarily know how to all act on it, or they act on it in different ways. So my reason for being here is that I'm interested to hear the debate about change. I think it's a fascinating sector, and yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Johnny. So, my background is, for more than 2 decades, I worked in Big Pharma, GSK, Glaxo, and heritage companies. I worked in new product development, formulation, R&D, new product introduction, clinical supplies, and finally in strategy and alliances. And during that time, I was involved in many re-engineering projects. We were looking at re-engineering the process with a huge focus on productivity and reducing attrition. And we were enormously successful, weren't we? Because productivity and attrition is still atrocious. For the last 10 years, I've been involved with emerging technologies. I set up a regenerative medicine company from Imperial. I have set up a smart medical textiles, Parafricta, where we're using a textile to prevent fragile skin degrading and therefore prevent wounds using smart textiles and technologies. And I'm now with CN Bio. And at CN Bio, we're seeking to bring together precision to biology. And to change the way that we do drug discovery. In the absence of anything better, for the last 50 years or so, we've been using animals as surrogates for humans, only to find that in late-stage R&D, animals don't react the same as humans to all drugs. And we start from targets that we have a good idea might affect the disease, only to find in late stage that it doesn't always impact the right disease. The US government have driven an initiative to create a surrogate human. And the Harvard Emulate consortium have chosen to deliver a complex and specific approach to particular organs. CN Bio are part of the MIT consortium, and CN Bio and MIT have chosen to use precision engineering to make easy plug-and-play platforms that you can then use to build human disease models. We've got a very advanced liver disease model that we have now got hepatitis B and NASH working models. We're working with liver metastasis and immunology groups, because in these later things, animals don't make good human models. So you need human disease models from the outset. The FDA have been involved in this journey from the outset so that we know what we're trying to do. And so what we're trying to do is provide biological models that people can alter the precision of what they're doing. You can alter the cells you're putting in. You can really strictly control all the biological parameters, and then you know the quality of the data that's coming out the other end. And because it's using human microtissues, then you can understand that data. And we've created a plug-and-play platform where we have demonstrated in February 7 interacting human different disease organs and shown that the results you get from these interacting human disease organs are very different from what you get from animal tests and very different from what you get with other sequential designs and mimic what has happened in the human being. So then MIT are really keen. Doug Luffenberger, who's head of computational biology, he's really keen then to take this idea so that he can drive huge quantities of biological data to put into his computational model to design phenotypic type drugs in a completely different way. And so this is kind of not doing a little bit of increment on what we've always been doing, but trying to rethink why is it drugs are failing and what can we do to change them? And we're working with one big pharma company to look at reprocessing a drug that failed in phase 3 clinical studies. They know the targets that were involved, the targets just weren't right for the disease, but there are other diseases that they think might be able to use those targets, and so using our disease models we can see if it does have an effect on the disease. So a bit of a long introduction, but what I wanted to do was give you ideas of what other companies and other ways are doing so that we've got incremental changes happening and we've got strategic changes and we've got technology changes. So let's start with Matt. Why don't you, Sorry, I want to go back. Sorry, Nigel, I think they said. Nigel, you said you've worked with many, many different kinds of companies and we've spotted some things that underpin successful innovation. Why don't you start the debate on some of the things you've spotted that really lead to successful innovation?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. And I wish I could, send you all away with the answer to this. I'm just going to chuck some ideas out, just some observations from having looked at the problem from many sides. So when I was with Roche in the 90s, there is absolutely no doubt that Roche would not have survived on its own discovery efforts. It was going through a terrible period. It was living out the last glory days of the benzodiazepines. Its own discovery was just not coming up with anything at all. And Roche wouldn't be here today and still being a successful company it is without the partnership with many companies, not least of which is Genentech. And most of the big sales for Roche today, I would say probably all of the big sales for Roche today have come from elsewhere. So I observed that. I also worked alongside Amgen when we were partnering with them, and I saw what they brought to the organisation. And it really makes you think about some questions about, and we're going to come onto this later, about whether it's inevitable that when a small company grows, it loses what makes it successful. But I've been thinking about, what are the attributes that underpin the innovation in the companies like Genentech, like Amgen, when they're growing. And, I'm going to bandy some words around here, and I'm just to get you going really, but, is it empowerment? Is it culture? Is it intellectual freedom? Is it single-minded focus? Is it the short decision-making? Is it risk appetite? Is it adaptability? I think it's actually probably many of those things, but in my current role, I see that the real innovation that certainly that we get a chance to get involved with comes from either academia or really small companies. And you start thinking, what have academia and really small companies got in common? Because actually they're quite different on the face of it. There's no drive for entrepreneurship in a lot of academic units, absolutely not. And I don't think there's that kind of single-minded focus, in a research institute where all research groups are all doing their own thing. So I've really just tried to think, what does an academic group and a small biotech have in common? And I think the only thing I can pick out, and it certainly plays to some discussions earlier this morning, is following the science. And I just wonder if ultimately that's what it's all about. And then also, just to sort of follow on from that, can you ever get that in a large organisation? And I've just chucked that out, leave it there.
Johnny, you come from a different creative industry. Any lessons from there?
Well, I was laughing to myself this morning in the first session when they were talking about qualitative research, and it was the death of advertising. You put a few people into a small room with getting a cup of tea and a biscuit, and a few people hid behind glass while they talked about your ad, and it was completely destroyed. And actually, it was quite interesting. So the parallel is coming in with pharma, and this is 25 years later. But actually, it's also interesting that there are less marketing directors now on the board of FTSE companies than any time in the last 50 years, and that's probably interesting in the context that actually technology has emerged to change the role of marketing directors in the previous guys. But I'm very interested in what makes a creative or an idea-centric company. And having worked in, Soho House was very creative in what it did. Obviously, in its day, Saatchi & Saatchi was a very creative agency. We're trying to do the same in biotech. And there seem to be sort of three themes that come, and that is fostering the culture of ideas right in the beginning, and welcoming those ideas. And this isn't just an innovations group that goes and they think they're the rock stars of molecular biology. It is actually encouraging really good creativity in manufacturing and regulatory in these areas, who are now, I think, in the sort of new era of potential personalized medicine and the like, precision medicine. These groups are being thrust into the middle, and I think that's very interesting. So the culture is the first thing. The second thing is having something to push against. Great creativity comes against sort of a rebellion in a way against silo thinking. Punks came out because they were pushing against disco. And it seems that in staid, tired organizations, creativity can blossom. And the third thing is actually having somebody at the top who buys into creative thinking and wants to encourage and foster and accept creative thinking. And that's where advertising as a sector changed, because the supposed, what they were called the bean counters, took over, and they looked at driving money, and they looked at driving profit and squeezing margins, and they ignored the fact that this was a creative sector.
Other things that people feel have really sponsored and pushed forward entrepreneurial spirit and innovation.
Yeah, I think what you got to go back to is really what's the environment that best fosters the creative development of ideas. And unfortunately, in many large organizations, those things just don't exist. They're either stifled in silos, or they're how do you say, concreted in by entrenched mentality. And unfortunately, that's the real problem. The concept of critical mass in large organizations, and one of the questions we were talking about earlier is, do organizations have to get bigger to survive? And growth for the sake of growth, is that really a great thing or not? In this case, the environment with which we choose to foster and grow ideas is definitely best, for some reason, driven by smaller organizations. Not in all cases, but in our business, because of the way things are. I mean, over 60% of the intellectual property that is being commercialized today is a result of small organizations, and you just can't deny that reality. And so it's just something I think that we have to really sit back and think about.
Does anyone have any examples of what they think is real innovation or entrepreneurship in a large company environment? Yeah, sure.
Is there a mic coming?
Yeah, just come.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Beth Nickel. I'm from Pfizer. I loved what you said, Johnny, because for me, within global clinical supply, which is the area that myself and some of my colleagues in the room are part of, we do have a leader that does value some dare to try, if you want to coin a phrase, a dare to try initiatives. And only a couple of weeks ago, we had the chance to have a face-to-face in the US, where we had a whole morning dedicated to dare to try. Now, was it a gimmick? Probably not, because people have come away from that with an incentive that they can think about other ideas within the realms of their work that they can then try and implement in different areas. Now, I'm not saying Big Pharma doesn't do it well, but I'm saying we do it, and it may not be seen to the outside world, but it is being done, and it does feel valued as an employee to do it.
Yep, thank you. And at the back, with your hand up.
I think you're asking the wrong question.
Okay.
The reason is because I think, in today's complex world, it's not about one organisation and whether one organisation or one model is the right solution.
Exactly.
You've got this thing called an ecosystem. Now, yesterday I was a little depressed because people kept talking about it, but I saw it solely as an analogy. But there is this complex thing. There is an ecosystem there. There are patients, there are payers, there are providers, there are people doing discovery, there are people in academia, there are venture capitalists. It's very complex. In that ecosystem, though, everybody's got a role. And what we shouldn't do is try and pigeonhole any one organisation as being able to solve all of the problems in that ecosystem. It's about finding the right niche and then getting companies that are really good at exploiting those niches and then everybody working together. So trying to find a big company that can do it, or by the way, I used to work for one, is the wrong answer. They're not going to be able to do it because that's like trying to find an animal that can do everything in an ecosystem. They don't exist. And it shouldn't exist in this ecosystem either.
And I totally agree with you there. Partnerships are really, really critical to everything we do. One person has no answer, and so one organisation has no total answers. And partnerships are absolutely crucial. There are different drivers of value. So all SMEs are measured on, on value creativity. How are they measured? They're measured by the number of deals you have with Big Pharma. Now, when you've tried to do a deal with Big Pharma on the small side, like every day I don't do something, my company has a day less to survive, right? That's what it's like. So if I don't achieve something today, then we're a day less in survival. Whereas in Big Pharma, they've got to escalate it up about 5 levels of steering committee and come back down again, and then they might phone up and then they'll call you at the last minute. You've managed to get a meeting, and only half the people deem it worth their while to turn up or even not turn up. And it's the same with investors. So, these are all barriers to us adopting innovative practices and making new things. What are the barriers and how do we get over them? How do we build partnerships that are win-win from the outset? Because win-win is what they have to be. That's what we're all in the business of doing, I believe. Only patients will get better treatments if we're in the business of winning together. Some of the thoughts we had in our previous discussions about adopting, what are the barriers to adopting new strategies?
Okay, so to the gentleman at the back, I actually agree with you, and I think we're seeing a real shift in terms of Big Pharma and the way it's looking at engaging with academia and smaller companies. It realises that it has to be done. Equally, to what Maureen was saying about 5, maybe 10 actually, layers that smaller companies or academia need to go through with industry, that's probably also true and very painful for those of you that are on the smaller side of things, but equally painful for a number of us that are on the bigger side of things because we want to get on and do it. I think in the real world, if we have bigger companies that are getting better at doing it, they're going to be the magnet for the smaller companies or the academic groups. And the other companies, simply for a competitive advantage, are going to have to take note of those processes and what they do. You're talking a little bit there about collaborations and how those things work. I've been involved in due diligences, and there is an arrogance, regardless of what company size you have, that you know what to do. The reality is, whether you're a small company or a big company, you get your clinical trials approved or your INDs approved. As you go through, you get your NDAs and European applications and worldwide applications approved. Everybody does it. We all do it differently. So instead of the Victor Meldrew, I really don't believe it, it's, I don't believe it, but actually, I've never really thought about that. Maybe there's something I can learn and tailor and apply to my own environment. Taking it out and putting it into a different thing, it isn't necessarily going to work, but it requires creativity and innovation to take that approach and see what we can do to make it work.
I know I ranted specifically earlier on the bigger companies thing, but just to follow on your point, specifically, what companies are doing now is specifically setting up, and I talked about earlier, culture and environment where these organizations can come in and have free space and make investment and get seed capital. And so the bigger companies are trying to address that issue and create this culture environment where you can drive free flow of ideas and give those entities a way to pollinate their technology in a way that they presently or possibly didn't have in the past. So it's another way to look at it, and Merck is specifically doing that on our side too, to try and drive innovation, specifically with small companies. But that question still exists: is how do you really get past? And it's funny, we were talking. One of the things that we had exchanged ideas on specifically prior to this panel is the us versus them mentality. That trying to bridge that, to me, is critically important, because if we're really going to generate value, we have to get past that. We're going to be separate organizations, but I always tease my kids. My kids, they'll fight and obviously beat the heck out of each other, and I'm like, you know what? We're all on the same team. We are striving for the same thing, and getting past that's really important.
I hear this, and I'm a small company, and we employ 30 scientists. We're private, so we're not having the pressures of a private equity company tell us to exit. And we want to collaborate with Big Pharma. And I heard the call yesterday of somebody on one of the panels said, look, we're fair. We're not going to come and nick your IP. Well, perhaps you can have a chat with your lawyers, because your lawyers are brutal. We send out very vanilla CDAs, very vanilla MTAs. We don't want, what's ours is ours, what's yours is yours, let's work together in the future. It's simple. But we're being forced into jurisdictions that we've never heard of before, because you've got legal companies there. We're a small company, we can't afford to employ a lawyer in these weird jurisdictions we've never heard of. This isn't fair. This isn't collaborative. This isn't relationship building. It strikes me, the whole thing is kind of weird. You start off in, when we were set out to do business development, we sat in a booth with a strange curtain, and somebody comes in and sits down and says, right, we have Big Pharma and we want to hear your story. And then you get shuffled around an organization that ends up with when somebody finds it interesting, you get shuffled into a legal group. And then you spend 3 months debating with this lawyers about jurisdiction and stuff that really is completely irrelevant. This is not collaboration. This is not equity. This isn't fair. And that's a clarion call for small biotech.
Nigel?
Just to echo Johnny's point, so as I mentioned before, we collaborate with lots of different companies. And right now, we are trying to tie down agreements with a couple of biotechs. They're both small, one's tiny, one's a little bit bigger. And we don't pretend to be a CRO. We're not a CRO. That's not what we're there to do. And we always emphasize that right at the start. We talk about what our strengths are. It's the access to the network. It's the pure focus on oncology. It's the fact we've been doing nothing but early drug development in oncology for 20-something years. And it's that we put on the table and offer to partners. And they come to the table saying that's what they want. And yet, compare and contrast two companies at the moment, let's say both biotechs. One of them is prepared to, and I used some words from yesterday that someone mentioned, they understand our perspective and they want to work with that perspective, and we want to look at them as well. And we're coming up with a really different way of working together, but it's about understanding where each other's come from. The other company, they talked that game, and now what they're trying to do is put in place an agreement, which is what they would have with a CRO, which is, you will do this by this point and this by this point. If you don't do this, you don't get that. And if you don't do this, you don't get that. That's not what we're about. And so that's just, it's about the mentality of partnership. It's about looking for that common ground. And then when you do get the lawyers involved, not letting them shape the agenda. Because I think that's the difference between these two companies. One is so small, they haven't even brought the lawyers in yet. I'm a bit scared about when they do, what's going to happen. The other company has got the lawyers involved straight away, and it's this CRO contract, which we don't want. And unless they change, we're probably that deal's probably going to fall apart.
We had Gentleman up here.
Okay, so my name's Duncan Judd. I'm a consultant based at the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst on the GSK campus. And I'd like to perhaps share with you one of my thoughts on this, what we might see in the future and indeed seeing now, sort of a glimmer of hope, shall we say. So it's one model where I've seen like three groups coming together, one of them being a charity, and I believe that they have a lot to bring, a crowd with vested interest and people who can bring something to the picnic in terms of a patient view. A small company stroke charity, MRCT in this case, it doesn't have to be them, but they're reasonably good at drug development. So taking ideas perhaps through to the clinic. And then the third part of the group is AstraZeneca. And okay, they're big players. They've got real good strengths in certain areas, like high throughput screening, for example. Now, MRCT are not particularly good in that area. But once they get a lead, they can optimize that. AZ can then take it on further if it's appropriate. But I think what the strength of it is that the charity has a group who can see the development, some of the, at the top level, not necessarily the details of it. It's instructive to the people in the charity so they can see how drug development is particularly difficult. But they all, so I feel that this is sort of like a model which could have a lot of benefits in this new collaborative area, and just wonder whether the panel would have some comments on that, please.
Yeah. I feel that this is one of the ways of going forward, because since I left Big Pharma, lots of my colleagues have done so as well, and all of us have focused on really different areas and different ways of doing things. So what we're discussing at the moment is, actually, do we need Big Pharma? Of course we need them at some point in time, but if Big Pharma aren't going to be responsive to the ways and new ways of doing things, why don't we all collaborate together? If we all firmly believe that there's a new way to do drug discovery, a new way to do clinical supplies, a new way to do clinical trials, and these guys have all had lots of experience in multiple organizations, then why don't we bring ourselves together and try and develop some drugs using our new paradigms all the way through? You need to have some really different types of backers to enable you to do that. And so far, they don't exist in the UK, but they certainly exist in America, and they absolutely exist in China and Asia Pacific. So, you know, there are new ways of doing things, and one of the, the largest pharma company at the moment probably isn't a pharma company, and certainly hasn't been around for millennia, but it did things in a very different way. Any other thoughts from colleagues? Or anyone from the floor?
Sure. So I do think you're quite right in terms of looking to do things differently, and sometimes it actually requires the, I'll put it in quotes, the outsider that has maybe come out from Big Pharma and is in a small startup and thinking differently and freeing things up, to have the courage to do the experimentation. The infrastructure in large pharma can be quite restrictive. And we addressed that a little earlier. But what you're doing with the creativity and the approach that you have, Maureen, is saying, we're going to try something. And if it works, you can bet your bottom dollar that the big boys and big girls are going to be coming after you saying, that's really good, and trying to adopt it and manage it. But it needs somebody to start the ball rolling. And sometimes that needs an independent thinker.
Absolutely. Johnny, I'll come back to...
I'd like to add on something that an earlier speaker said, which was, it seems that everything should come from the science, and the science comes from a patient need. We are, as I said, collaborating with a number of different pharma companies, and the ones that seem to be really interesting is their commitment to that, because they are building whole new platforms with that in mind, and rather than saying we've got this existing infrastructure, they're looking at the science as it coming over the hill and saying, look, this is really potentially very effective. CAR T could be very interesting. Personalized medicine could be very interesting. And rather than saying we're going to force fit it into our model where we've got thousands of salesmen going out flogging small molecule drugs, they're looking at building new platforms. And I think that's a fascinating model. And I think it's fascinating times because it's change.
So I'm Janet Allen, I'm from the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, and I'd like to follow up on the comment from the previous colleague in the audience. I really do believe that charities potentially have an enormous role from the point of view of integrating aspects of drug discovery. We have a patient voice, which is increasingly being brought forward in the whole chain. And if you look at things like the Accelerated Access Review, a lot of what the charities are trying to do is in that space. But we do have limited resources. And so, for instance, we're setting up a new clinical trials platform, and which potentially will help get new drugs through quicker to the clinic. But we need to be able to work with pharma to do this. And we find enormous obstacles to trying to build up those relationships. It comes back to the sort of lawyers again. Now, as a small charity, we can't employ the sort of lawyers that you engage with, and we're all wanting to do the same thing. We all want to get drugs to the market as quickly as possible. For us, it's for the benefit of our patients. For you, it's to see a return on your investment. And it just would be great if we could find a better way of bridging the gap between us.
I have heard that many times, and I've heard cited that regulations don't allow that the regulators do not want to see collaboration between patient advocacy groups and Big Pharma, and that is seen to be exerting an undue influence. That's not my experience at all, and I think it is a perception rather than reality. And you wanted to just add to that?
No, I agree 100% with that, and as I say, I think the whole movement in this country in particular, from the point of view of government statements like the Accelerated Access Review, imply that that's not the case. The other area that I think is a charity can potentially broker as a neutral broker is in the area of pre-competitive research. Yeah. And again, this is an area that I've been trying to do now for something like 3 or 4 years. I've been on the Big Pharma side of pre-competitive research, but trying to set it up with the charity as a neutral broker is so difficult. Yes.
Well, I was, as an aside, part of the Eve Appeal, which was set up, it was a charity set up to fund pre-competitive research into ovarian cancer, because people were wanting to do the late stage, but nobody wanted to get together to form the early stage. And so we've just raised money, actually, to support very early preclinical research on markers. So, you know, there is that influence. And conversely, with Parafricta, my skin technology, that came from Deborah talking to these children, the butterfly children as they're called. They have a genetic disorder and their whole skin just peels off. They're constantly ulcerated. And so there's a huge amount of research being done into trying to create emollient creams and drugs of this and that. But actually, when you talk to the patients, they just wanted something that wouldn't stick to their skin and that they could sleep on at night. And so we went to Formula One, and the airbags used in Formula One in defence agencies are ultra-low friction. And so we brought the technology of ultra-low friction, did some work in using those technologies, put it into the context of a medical device, did clinical studies, and then we sell as medical devices booties, undergarments and sheets, because that's what the patients in our space actually want, not a tube of messy cream. And the same with pressure ulcers. Again, everybody, there's a £1 billion industry out there all about pressure, relieving pressure and pressure ulcers, number one avoidable harm in the whole of the NHS. But pressure ulcers aren't really caused by pressure. I mean, it's really apparent. Just put your finger and rub it. It's not the pressure that causes the damage, it's pressure causing friction and shear damage. So we just went back to basics and said, well, it's not pressure. Actually, the science is saying the damage is caused by friction and shear at pressure points. So why don't we do something about relieving the friction and shear instead of the pressure? So, it is being driven by science, it is being driven by proximity to the patient groups, so that you're designing what patients want from the outset, and taking innovative approaches to what the solutions are. So, Sylvia, you had some thoughts to help us with what might be practices, strategies and tools that can be incorporated in partnerships from the outset that might lead us to a better conclusion and a better way of working together than just lopping IP ideas and lawyers at each other.
So I think we've actually captured some of those already, but the first thing is to remember a commonality of purpose. And whether that partnership is between companies, academia, or whether it's with regulators and payers, what's the common thing at the end of the day? It's the patient. What does everybody want? A medicine that works well for the patient, has a decent side effect profile, and if you're a payer, something that is considered to be cost effective. So the challenge I think that we often face with those collaborations, and having worked in alliances, what I can tell you is the internal discussions that we have pale compared with when we come together. The tribes unite, and so it does become a them and us, but it's about anchoring in that commonality of purpose, trying to work collectively with your relevant function in that other organisation. The steering committee exists, it probably always will, and things will get escalated. But the trick is to avoid that escalation, and part of it is putting that, I referred to arrogance earlier, putting that arrogance aside and actually just taking stock of what the other party brings, and then exploring it and discussing it, because you'll appreciate any aspect of ideation. You have that idea, it's fantastic. It becomes brilliant when you have input and direction and discussion from somebody else to take that forward. You incubate and sort it through. And I think those would be my key points. Anchor in the commonality, listen to one another. Differences exist. They should exist, they're good to exist, it's what keeps things alive and continues to challenge us. And if you need to escalate, then yes, go ahead and do it. But I think very often when people come together, they're really excited about what it is they're doing. And something happens along the way. Just remember that excitement.
We had a gentleman here who was keen to say something while you get them.
Oh, thank you. My name's Howard Marriage. I work part-time at the Crick Institute. I very much enjoyed the conversation. I think, one, it's leadership that defines whether an organisation is able to innovate. And I absolutely saw that at the earliest days of Genzyme. We were allowed to try things that were previously untried, both in research and finance. The only rule was, if it failed, don't do it again. All right, that was the rule there. Onto the legal point. I mean, I like negotiation as much as anybody else, but it's often very unequal between pharma and particularly academic groups. Not thinking about the Crick in this instance, but I've seen agreements that you wouldn't accept as a small biotech with a pharma company. If a small biotech, if the company discontinues the program, you get it back, you can carry on trying to push forward for patient benefits. I've seen agreements done with academics where the project will never go back. The pharma discontinues, loses interest, but won't put it back. Now, there's no need to do that. That's just brutality of negotiation, just because it can. And you go back and you point that out, and they say, well, we've done the agreement. That's it. Go away. So that, I think we just need to keep the common purpose of that. But just at the Crick, we're trying an experiment of how to put experts close to the scientists. And one of the kind of our leading examples is working with GSK. We have an arrangement where we both bear our own costs, pick the projects. We're up to about 17 projects now with GSK. And we're putting the capabilities of both sides as it's best apportioned on each of the projects. And they're getting early science. They're seeing things probably a couple of years before they would ever get published in Nature. They get to verify the work that gets there. So one of Big Pharma's arguments, they can never replicate the work. They get to see the work, they get to believe it. But actually, they don't get to own the IP. All right, we get to take the IP to the party that's best able to develop it. So you need a new develop some new paradigms here and be comfortable with them. So that's an experiment. We will all be able to explain in the next 5 years whether it's actually worked or not, but we will certainly do that.
Thank
Can
you.
I come back up?
Yes, Johnny?
Just before, as a sort of caveat to that, it's not just big pharma lawyers that should have a kicking. It's tech transfer officers, because some of them are absolutely brutal, and it's just hindering research. That's our experience. And to pick on another thing you said from the leadership aspect, I think at the end of the day we can't forget that it's about relationships as well, and that comes from the top of an organisation. You know, we used to heavily lunch at Saatchi's, and it was a fantastic thing. And it built relationships, and they were enduring and sustaining. And I did I'm not a big fan of social media, but I was put on LinkedIn, and the first thing that came up as an attribute was lunch. And I'm a big believer in that, because it's a good way to build relationships between organizations.
It's funny you say that, because I'll tell people perpetually whenever I get a chance that the concept of zero risk also equals zero drugs. And that's really, when you get down, the legal process today almost is set up to drive away the need or necessity for relationships. Because at the end of the day, if the concept of trust is being relegated irrelevant to the process. And it's really important that I think we all remind ourselves of the relationship component, because, I mean, realistically, you get back to culture, you get back to organization, you're incubating something that actually can make an organic nature grow, something that's going to give you fertile ground to grow something. And I think that's lost. I think it's lost in the process at times.
Thank you. We had a gentleman here.
Yeah, it's Simon Kerr from Sopranos. So we are a small biotech company. We work very closely with patients. We have a single-minded focus on the science. One of the observations that Sylvia made, I thought was worth commenting on. When we nominate a preclinical candidate, we brought in somebody onto the team from Big Pharma, and his comment was, well, you mean we don't need an 80-page report that nobody's going to read in order to nominate the preclinical candidate? And effectively, we have the benefit of being fast and nimble as well, and that is an attribute clearly that Big Pharma are keen to partner with, because we have a whole effective network of meetings around the world where we are, as Johnny says, meeting with pharma companies continuously. And I don't see there being an us and them. I see there being a very open-minded approach to innovation that's going on in biotech, with some good exemplars such as the Johnson & Johnson Innovation Centre just up the road here, which is clearly designed to make sure the door is open and that they're getting access to early innovation. And I know that's going on in other companies represented on the panel too.
So on the upside, I think the day of the 80-page report is short-lived, because with moves to transparency and disclosure, I'm sure there'd be a genuine reluctance to have 80-page reports. And I don't mean that because there's something to hide. But you're right. And as a regulator, I work with teams. We produce briefing documents for agencies. And a fair amount of my time is actually condensing it down. So what is the key point that needs to come across here? Provide that rationale, provide the thought, reference any guideline as needed, but make it short and sweet, because you all sat here, it's coming up to break time soon, going to rush out, go get a coffee. Hopefully the discussion's been interesting enough to keep you going. But imagine if you had to sit here and read through the transcript of what went on here, okay? You'd go for the edited highlights. So I agree with you. I think we can be simpler in the way that we do things. And I come back to a word or a phrase I used earlier, which is template thinking. We have a lot of templates that regulators ask us to use. We have a lot of internal templates. Probably the proportion of templates increases linearly with the scale of the company. I don't know. I put it out there for something for people to think about. But sometimes to me it is really more about throwing that up in the air and saying what needs to happen. I'll give you an example. Some time ago, within the company, we were going to do our first ever re-examination of a CHMP opinion. And so I called the team together, and they said to me, so where's the template? And I said, there isn't one. And there was a silence. And then a small voice said, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going to tell a story. We're going to tell our story. And I think, because I was new into the product and the project, I came with a fresh pair of eyes, which again goes to innovation and creativity and thinking. I listened to all the bits and pieces. I had an understanding as to why we'd been rejected, and in point of note, 2 other companies with the same indication were also going to be rejected and also appealed and also lost. But the point was, having told the story, did we get a change and get the label approved? No. Did we shift opinion? Yes. 25% of the CHMP felt that there should be some sort of statement in the labelling. But we threw the template out of the window. We started again with what is really bugging them as regulators that we need to address, and how do we marry that up with the European environment for this particular indication and patients that have been long suffering, and actually telling the story in a report but in a short, succinct way is a good way to move that forward.
Thank you. I think we're drawing to a close. I think that we've had an interesting debate about what can stimulate substantial change, because it's not a step change we need. We do need a completely new way of doing things, and collaboration, partnerships, technology are all important. And if Big Pharma aren't prepared to do it, then others will. CN Bio is not an SME. We were actually bought out by a Chungnam Corporation in Hong Kong and China. They make precision engineering. They make all the touch screens that you've been whacking on all day. They make hybrid buses. They make loads of the raw materials that will go into 3D printing. And they believed that precision engineering, they believed our story, that bringing precision to biology could make a step change. So they invested in us, and they have been brilliant investors. There have been no steering committees. There have been no day-to-day control. We've changed our technology a couple of times because the first ones just weren't right. What helped us get through was that one of the brothers, the president of Chungnam Innovations, believed our story. And he sits on our board. And there are no steering committees to be reviewed. We manage it as a completely separate company. He joins on the board. He challenges us on the vision. If he thinks there's something we can learn from another part of the organisation, he puts us in touch. But we don't go through any of the bureaucracy that all the other divisions in his organisation have to do. So it's about commitment from the top. He has demonstrated that he bought us because he believed we could make a difference. He's allowing us to make that difference, and he's allowing us to continue to operate as an SME and build our own relationships and partnerships. So I think if Big Pharma don't change, LG and lots of other companies are out there looking to get into this space because it is an unmet need and there are new ways of doing things. So to quote somebody across the border, or misquote him really, the making of medicines is a complicated business, folks, with increasingly novel approaches. Last century, it was all about small molecules with the occasional venture into antibiotics and vaccines, and neither the twain shall meet. This century, it's about cells, genes, precision biology, computational, in silico, textiles, apps, smartness. We need to adapt and adopt new ways of working and thinking, and if we don't, somebody else will. Thank you for your time and your input.